Sponsored by Winwing Technologies. You'll feel the flight regime, guns, gear, high alpha, and others. Hello valued viewers, I hope you're all doing very well. My friend Joshua and Daiichi, we were just chatting about the sinking of the Moskva, and I'm sure a lot of you have been chatting as well, and I thought, because they are absolutely not naval experts per se, but they do have a naval experience, I just thought it might be interesting for you guys. Daiichi, can you just quickly tell us what you can of your naval background so we know who we're talking to?
I served 4 years on destroyers, a Spruance class destroyer known as Cushing, and then I transferred over to an Orly Burke USS Steedham. I was over in Yokosuka, Japan for my 4 years.
Joshua, you're, I believe, speaking on your brother who was a USN man. Can you just talk a little bit about that, please?
My brother was a submariner in the United States Navy. This goes back from the early 80s up to the late 90s. And he was on a ballistic missile boat, an SSBN, Ohio class. And so we talk a lot about this stuff. He gives me feedback and I ask him questions and things. So you could kind of think of me kind of like a Tom Clancy type where it never really was in the military, but I do a lot of reading and I have contacts that I can talk to about this sort of thing. Completely and utterly declassified, of course. That's where I fall into these sort of things.
Very good. I'll cut to the recording.
The reason why I wanted to talk to you is that the Moskva, one of the things that we looked at and that my brother talked about in the U.S. Navy, what was, when you were in the Navy, what was one of the biggest things that they drilled in your head?
Damage control for everybody.
Damage control. You're absolutely correct. My brother, damage control. Everybody was a firefighter. Everybody knew every little line on the sub. Probably the same case in your instance, correct?
Yep, I know actually what originated that.
Yes. Which incident?
Oh, I don't remember the carrier name, but there was a carrier in the Vietnam War where I can't remember precisely what happened.
Forrestal
The
fire?
Oriskany.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was the Forrestal and the Oriskany. They both had pretty much the same kind of issues. Even the Enterprise caught on fire as well and burned pretty severely. But all of that goes back to damage control. That is one of the biggest things that's drilled into naval personnel is damage control. So that means everybody from whether you're enlisted all the way up to essentially if you're an admiral knows how to do damage control on a boat. They all can pick up a fire hose and know how to fight a fire or deal with casualties or deal with stuff like that. In the Russian Navy, they do not do that. They don't have damage control. Well, they do have damage control, but it's very few people. Everybody else goes and does their own thing. Then you ask, how do I know this? Well, my brother got to actually go on board some Russian ships when they had like a goodwill tour back in the early 90s along the East Coast. I don't know if you remember that or not. It's when the Russians came over here after the wall fell and everything. The Russian ships are not really set up for that sort of thing. That's one of the reasons why the ship sank the way it did. And that's one thing that they believe from analysts and everything talking about it. Another thing, too, is look at your Arleigh Burke. You look at an Arleigh Burke, or whether it be a Ticonderoga class, or even go back, let's look at a Perry class frigate. It's not necessarily, they don't have magazines like they used to on destroyers and Iowa class boats. And if they had magazines. These ships now have everything. I don't know how it is on the Arleigh Burkes anymore or even the Ticonderogas, but the magazines aren't as big as what they used to be on these other ships from what I understand. Everything is built like the Tomahawks are in a protective armored box, if I'm not mistaken. Is that correct? Am I thinking on those?
The armored box launcher is slightly different, but the way it works is each of those missiles is like in a container and it's lowered into place. That's part of the modularity, but every single cell has a firefighting component. I can't remember precisely what's in it.
But it's protected though. Am I correct in thinking that? I mean, it's got some protection around it.
Slightly, the actual launcher itself and the part above it, like the hatches, would be like a little bit of protection for it, but it's not like it's fully armored all the way.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I know as far as magazines, there's not as much. Like, you have the missile launchers that is the magazine. Then you have the Mark 41 gun. It will have its magazine a few decks down. And then for the Sea Whizzes, it is the magazine. Like, that's one of the great things about the Phalanx is that all of its ammo is built into the gun. Whereas the Russian system, it has like a giant belt that's a deck under it, which is the reason why some smaller ships don't have the AK-630s, or it has to be built into the ship. You can't just retrofit it in.
Where's all these stores located on it? And this is one of the reasons why the time that my brother was in the silent service, these things were nothing but floating targets, is all the missiles are sitting on the outside. And he said, shoot, you can get one missile in there and hit one of those things and you set the whole ship on fire with just one missile. You know, if you hit one of those tubes right there, which is not protected. I was watching this one guy called Jive Turkey.
I'm in his Discord.
I remember he was talking about these ships and stuff like that. And he says it's dumb the way they've got everything just hanging on the side of the ship, because one shot, heck, you could take a round or something like that. You set off one of those missiles in those tubes, you blow up the whole ship. You know, it was very weird how the Russian mentality thinking is hanging all its armament on the side. I mean, you're just asking for problems at that point.
I'm a little skeptical about how much damage it could do, but for me, that's just because when I watched my sprue can get Sink-X'd because she was the last one Cushing, they did drop like 1,000-pound bombs on it and such, and it's not really catastrophic damage, but it will hurt, but it won't like one hit KO it like the way some people make it sound like it is, but it not something you want.
Well, yeah, I mean, now you're talking about a ship that's unarmored, that doesn't have any armament on it anymore. I'm pretty sure that they did remove all that stuff, correct? When they
Yeah.
did the Sink-X?
I mean, I'm talking about like the blast wave. Like some people like it'll sink it, and it's like it doesn't have the power to have that blast wave. Well, unless if it's one of the nuclear tipped ones, which
Oh,
it's
yeah.
suspected there was 2 on there. That will kill anything if you face tank it. But
Oh, yeah. The thing that we're looking at here is that when the Moskva sank, those could go off on the side. Well, it's going to do exactly what you really wanted to do, is impair the ship from carrying out its function.
yep, mission
You
kill.
know, you don't necessarily sink it; you just take it out of action, which is essentially the same thing as sinking it. You know, pretty much. You would actually have to hit it with probably a torpedo or something like that. You know, or Mark 48 or something like that could take it out. You know, you create a gap up underneath there of nothing but air, and it breaks its back. Essentially, is what happens. It doesn't really hit it.
Some of those modern torpedoes, like Mark 48s, those are like my number one nightmare. Like people's like, oh,
Oh, yeah.
man, you've got all those missiles to worry about. I was like, those aren't really as nightmare inducing as a Mark 48 or well, I know some of the Chinese ones with the
Yep.
that are wake homing, but still, it's like it hits you, you ain't going anywhere.
Yeah, it's the you know, you're above. If you hit the superstructure, okay, you've damaged the superstructure. You can take it out of action if you hit it in the right place, but you're not going to sink the ship. You know, you have a Mark 48 explode up underneath you, you break the back of the ship, you sink. You know, that's the end of that. Pretty quick from what I gather with a 48.
In fact,
Um,
if you've seen a few Sink X's, sometimes the ship will split in half. That's because they finished the Sink X with the Mark 48. It breaks the keel, which is effectively the back, and then because it doesn't have that support anymore, the ship will just come apart.
the reason why I just wanted to tell you about that is, Cap, is that's one of the major, in the Navy's perspective, when they look at it, is one of the major setbacks of the Russian military force, is that where they put their ammo, their damage control seriously falls behind what the United States and even England. England has this essentially the same damage control that we have here in the United States. Their mentality is exactly the same as what ours is. And that comes from years of learning, all the way back to the age of sail, of how they do it. We actually learned a lot from England as far as how to do our damage control. And then again, it goes back to the Americans. We adjusted it for our needs here. That's one of the reasons why those ships that Moskva sank the way it did. Didn't hit it under the surface. It was just from what they're saying, is bad damage control. They could have saved the ship, but really didn't. I mean, that was just a superstructure hit on the ship. Another thing too is that if you look at what they're saying also is that the ships that they had in port at the time when they moved the Moskva back, and when they were moving it, some ships stayed very close in when they were taking the Moskva out from its first initial hit that it took. When it took the last one, the last hit that actually sank it, not sure how many were fired. And what was fired was subsonic, essentially harpoon missiles, which was built by somebody, I think.
I could go into detail about that.
You could go into detail about that. I'm not sure what they were. Jive Turkey says is those initial engines to get it boosted were harpoon engines or harpoon motors on the back of them. But after that took place, the Russian fleet that was in port was moved very far back out to sea, which means they moved back because something that Ukraine had scared them. And so they pushed their fleet back. So they moved them very far south to get their fleet away. So now what you're looking at along the Ukraine coast is they don't have air defense anymore. That was one of the big things that the Moskva was doing in the area, was providing a lot of that and onshore bombardment with missiles and things like that. From what I gather and from what I understand from what I have been reading,
losing the Moskva is big because they don't. The only other things that really have that really wide range area is Slavas or Kirovs. The other ships do have some decent air defense. Like I know they have a Submarine, which does have it does some decent air defense, and also they have like those smaller frigates. I think it's the Admiral Gorvorgovich. I probably mispronounced that one. They have like an upgraded version of the Buk launcher. It doesn't really compare to Fort as far as range and such. It's basically they've got medium and short range now. They don't have any long range SAMs for ocean work.
And another thing that Jive Turkey was talking about as well is that the Moskva has an awesome array of sensors on that ship. As far as air defense, radar capability, he went into detail about the types of radar that was on the Kirov, and I'm sorry, on the Moskva, and he doesn't understand how they could let something like this get through. I don't think at this point we don't know if it was a barrage that was sent out or one that was sent out, but he said even still it was almost impossible to get anything through from what we understood to the ship.
Yeah, that's right.
Especially subsonic.
Yeah, that was something that I was actually going on with Cap before he called you up. I highly suspect that the captain got tunnel visioned on those the drones that they were flying around trying to chase Glory, and ironically he lost the ship that was named Glory. I have multiple questions, like she should have had escorts. What were they doing? It definitely looks like it didn't try to defend itself for one reason or another, which could be that top-down command structure like you were referencing. Like, I think that has something to play into it. Trying to think what else.
As you know, we've studied the ship in detail, Daishi, and it should be first of all, it should be able to defend itself perfectly well, even from these multiple directional threats. A lot of people are saying that they distracted it with drones, and I'm sure that's right, from one angle, and that apparently left it open on a different angle. But that's simply not true, even with a 1970s, 80s ship, although this is obviously modernized. But for a start, the search radar on the top is, as we know, a 360 omnidirectional 3D radar. So that will not get tied up with anything from any direction. That always sees everything.
It has two of them, in fact.
Yeah, exactly. Almost everything, as we know, has redundancy on this ship. So there's no reason for it to not see stuff from all angles, even if it's busy fighting something from one angle. That was the whole ethos of, obviously, this era of ship. Also, yes, the fire control radars that guide the missiles and so on are directional, as in you have to point them at the baddie, but as we discovered, the idea is you have multiple of them with redundancy. So you can have two fire control radars fighting some baddies on the east and two fire control radars fighting something from the west. So there should be nothing here that's tied up unless you start factoring in A, equipment failure, maybe some of the fire control radars weren't working, B, probably more likely, crew problems. If the physical human doesn't see the threat or rate the threat very highly, then he might let something through on one side. But mechanically, engineering wise, everything should be there to defend omnidirectionally within reason. Obviously, if you've got 30 vampires coming at you in a clump, you can't defend against that. But if it's just a few, I don't see why it could have been sunk in terms of directional distraction.
Yeah. Also on top of that, it was like something else I was mentioning about how it has like some electronic warfare. Like maybe not the jammers probably didn't get deployed, but you have like passive listening, like how you have on planes like the RWR. These ships have different forms of that. In fact, this ship I would say has two different systems. It should have picked up the radar locking onto it, so they should have known something was coming at it. One thing that I heard is that they only got the launchers ready about like 2 weeks ago, so on top of that, they might have been confused as to what they were detecting. So that might have played a bit into it, but they should have known something was coming for multiple reasons. The fact that they failed to react to it properly based on like all their systems are pointed aft. Like it's like they didn't even try to defend themselves. There's something severely wrong there.
Something else that you can take into effect or into account of that as well, so well as chain of command on that as well. You know how the American chain of command works. You know, in modern in the Navy wise goes. You know, things can be done proactively, I guess. If somebody sees something coming, I can turn, hey, there's something coming. I don't know how it is on your ship. I mean, if you had something coming in, I don't know how it is on the surface fleet. I generally talk about submarines and stuff like that. But if you've got something coming in on an early berg, you see it. Do you have to call up the captain and say, hey, there's something coming. Can I shoot at it? You know, and it's low. I've identified it as an incoming missile. Can I fire at it? Or do you just say, hey, you know, I don't know if you've got a Cobb or something like that standing beside you. Can he take, action on that? Right? How does that work?
I'm not entirely sure of the full process because my jobs was never really in CIC. But I do know that they'll have like different watch standards for officers, and they have headsets and such between like the EW system, like I was mentioning, which would detect when something like any kind of radiation, like radars and such. Then you got like the Spy One radars that's on the top. They all communicate with each other, so they probably would know what's going on, and then I believe the officers can watch that too. I don't know if they have to authorize the launch, but wouldn't take very long to get a missile launch, as far as I understand it.
From what I understand on the Russian side, now again, take this with a grain of salt. This is just what we have talked about, and from what my brother understands with things as far as chain of command goes, that sometimes some of this stuff has to go straight up to the very top. Okay, the information has to be relayed. This goes back to old Russian times. You got to let the main guy in charge know. He's got to make the decision, before anybody else can act. This goes back to the Cold War era times, and they still have that mentality a lot. If you go back to those times, that maybe what was happening on board the Moskva at the time that it was hit was the guy that was in charge, or the captain of the ship, was getting information overload.
Yeah.
And he just could not react upon what he was getting and then send out all the information quick enough. On our side, we can take action. For instance, if in the submarine, if there's flooding in the back or if something goes wrong in the back, you don't necessarily have to go to the captain and say, hey, can we fix the problem? No, you just take action right then and there and fix the problem, and take care of it. That sort of thing. You don't have to run everything through the captain. That's why the ship works in a really good flow the way it does and stuff. But from the from what I understand about Russian military chain of command, is that you've got to get, you've got to talk to the head guy in charge, and then you've got to do this, you got to do that, and stuff like that. It was very similar to the guy that didn't push the trigger back in the day when they had a solar flare, and the Russians thought that the U.S. was launching missiles at them and stuff, but it wasn't. It was just the sun reflecting off the satellite. I don't know if you've heard that story or not. Stuff. The guy didn't push the button, when he was told to, and stuff. He was like, wait, let's just wait a minute. Found out it was just the sun reflecting off the satellite, and it thought it was a missile launch.
And now he's recognized as a hero.
Yes,
you don't get that very often.
But he actually got put in jail because of it too, because he didn't listen. And so it was, but then now he's recognized as a hero of it on both sides of the thing. But I'm thinking that's probably what could have happened.
An extension of that, it's something we've been discussing in Subbrief's Discord, is how a lot of their forces don't really have NCOs, or what we would call non-commissioned officers. Where basically we can do some things independently as long as we're not really like acting against orders and such. Like we'll get general ideas of things to do. Like I don't need to get the captain's permission to do maintenance or training or things like that. It's more of he'll just say, "Hey, we want to get these things done," and then sometimes it's left up to us to figure out what order to get the stuff done. Like we'll just get like a list of stuff from like the chief and be like, hey, we're gonna go figure this out. Sometimes she'll divvy it out, or he will, or sometimes it's up to like the E6s, E4s to divvy up the work and handle it.
Well, it's like that time Jive Turkey took over that ballistic missile submarine for about 2 minutes.
Are you talking about the ping?
Yes, when they were going to make the turn and he was trailing the towed array. And he was like, he ran up there in the con and said, don't turn right now.
Yeah.
And it was like, what? And stuff. But, that he didn't get in trouble for it, or anything like that. He was just told, okay, we understand, just don't do it again, Yeah. But he did, they didn't turn the ship, because he saw something that was contradictory to what was going on. He didn't want to cut the towed array, from what I understand. If that's what happened, I need to watch the video again.
That's the rough gist of it. Is like he ended up going up to the captain. This is something that he discussed in one of his videos where he's playing a game called Cold Waters, where he just basically, usually there's a process to be like, hey, you talk to someone else, and then the navigators get the word from them. But he went directly to the navigators or the captain, I can't remember what, and said, don't turn the ship right now, which it's against procedure, but since, it was done for the good and everything, it turned out all right. Russian sailors, like the enlisted men, aren't trained that way.
Yes.
In fact, one of the things that puzzled them was the idea that we could leave the ship that night and then we come back the next morning just willingly. They could not understand that at all.
It's the complete difference on that, as to how the two think. So I didn't know, Cap, if you understood that completely about how
rigid.
The differences, and it goes way more in depth than this. I mean, we could sit here and have a forum about this kind of thing. I mean, it's ridiculous about just the amount of information or the differences and and stuff. Listen, don't even get me started about the submarine. I'm talking about the surface fleet. The submarines on the Russian side, it's, oh my gosh, it's terrible. The American submariners feel really terrible for the Russian guys that have to go out in these ships or in these boats. They are horrendous, and it's terrifying just to actually think about what they have to deal with out there. I mean, their submarine fleet, there's a lot of them, but they prefer quality. No, they prefer quantity over quality. They want all these ships out there. Well, they go out with 80% of the ship working. And or the boat working, and it's terrible. If we've got, if we don't have milk in the refrigerator, we don't leave port. It's just the way it works. They'll go out with, we've got a leak in the reactor room. I don't care. Go to sea. And it's and you got these guys that aren't fully trained on the systems, and you've got very few that are trained. And stand here, watch this, and if it goes above this, let me know.
AKA the Kursk incident.
Yes, that's one of them. There's been plenty more besides that. Look at how many submarines the U.S. has lost. As far as nuclear wise goes, we've lost 2. Okay, the Thresher and the Scorpion. We've lost those ships because we were still learning. The naval doctrine in the United States is written by blood. Daesh, you can confirm that. That's how our doctrine is written. The Russian doctrine, I don't think it's even began to been written at all, because they'll go out and they'll send these vessels out, and they die, and they're like, okay, whatever, get in the same one that we built and send them back out there to replace it, and not learn from their incidences. We don't want to lose people. Their force is expendable, and it's sad.
Yeah, to expand upon that written in blood thing, one of the things that came from that was a program called SubSafe. In fact, we take it so seriously, there was one of the people who was doing the testing, and she would just fudge the numbers a little bit. I think she got like 20 years for that or something like that in jail. We don't play that game at all.
We don't want to lose stuff. And see, now this goes back again to the UK's boats. The UK has the same mentality as well, and that's why y'all haven't lost ships either. It's because we kind of share knowledge between the two countries as far as that goes. Now, y'all do y'all's own nuclear program, y'all do y'all's own everything else, but as far as what we learn from what our mistakes are, we learn from what your mistakes are. We want to interchange that so that we have a good working relationship. So one of the things too is that we've had UK sailors come aboard our ships and vice versa. And that way, now there's some areas that we can't go into because, again, it goes back to your nuclear program differs from ours. And I'm talking about as far as nuclear reactors and things like that. We tend to learn from each other. We want that knowledge. It's a friendly working relationship that we have with the UK. And that's why we do it with other countries as well, such as Japan and everything else. It's not just to get out there and just to have war games together. It's to get out there and learn what the other country is doing. Now, I don't know about the surface fleet. I don't know if you've ever had other nations come aboard an Arleigh Burke, and see how things are done on that side. I just know what they did with submarines and stuff like that. My brother told me, he said on the Los Angeles class boats that, yes, they did do that. They were very reluctant to put them on board a ballistic missile boat. So they didn't, I think they didn't want somebody else riding around. But on the attack class boats, they did. And they'd go out for like a week or something like that, and then drop them off or put them back on the other boats. Did they do anything like that on your side when you were in? I don't know. How long were you in for anyway?
I was in for 4 years. It was 2003 to 2007.
Okay.
It's kind of funny you mentioned the Japanese because I was forward deployed in Yokosuka, Japan. I think sometimes I think we did do that once or twice, but sometimes it's enough to train them on like certain systems or how to use data links properly and such, and then we'll go out and train and such, and then sometimes we'll just do exercises, especially with North Korea, but we will train with them all the time. Like, it's part of the reason why when I was forward deployed, we would spend 2/3 of a year just going out there for weeks, just training ourselves, helping to train some of the other nations there and to get ready in case something bad ever happened. Because you never know.
Yeah.
As we've seen.
Cap, we're not boring you to death, are we?
I'm in this place where I don't have much to add, obviously, in this case.
Yeah.
I'll kind of summarise what we've said, just so I can get my head around it. We were talking about why the Moskva went down so easily. One thing I picked up from you guys is a question mark about the external storage. So you've got the sandboxes or the Vulcans on the outside of the ship. Fair enough.
Yeah, and I think we can definitely confirm the AK-630s, their ammunition blew up. I think that's pretty much confirmed at this point.
Roger, and that's right in the place where that missile hit. So that makes sense. Human damage control doctrine probably lacking, probably in the Russian fleet. And you guys were discussing how on US ships in real life you have pretty much everyone trained to do damage control. The pushback was probably or possibly that the Russians only have certain members trained to do damage control, which is obviously a deficit. Did I pick that up right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And thirdly, probably most importantly, was what I picked up as in Russian stuff, a top-down, rigid human fire control system. So the engineering seems good, as long as it works like it is on paper. They've got radar coverage, they've got systems, they've got the ability to deal with 360-degree simultaneous threats. But whereas, for instance, an American ship may have a more dynamic human side of it, where they can take more control if needed, it looks like what we've discussed in the Russian equivalents. The guy at the top is going to be approving everything, and of course that's a massive problem because he will get work overload and have missiles getting through and hitting the ship. So that was the third thing. And the fourth thing is purely speculative. I've had I've had 3 emails on this now from just guys that email in saying that all 3 of these guys have actually studied Russian frigates in real life, old 80s frigates, and they did not have what the Americans would have the equivalent of, which is, let me read, watertight hull subdivisions, which I think is something like you would have had in the Titanic, where you cut off different sections so that if a torpedo hit, the other sections would still float. And they didn't have that because it makes it a much cheaper design, and they were speculating whether a cruiser at the same time, built in the same time in the 80s, could possibly have had the same deficit of lack of watertight hulls. However, that is purely speculative. And that's everything I've picked up so far, guys.
How do you do that?
It's a bit silly, isn't it?
That's appalling.
I guess it's just cheaper to build like that, right? I don't know this. This is just what people email to me with.
That's like not having watertight doors in your ship.
Having a canoe.
How?
Again, it goes back to, I want to get these ships out there, and I want a lot of them. So I'm not going to do that because that's just more work that we have to do and takes longer time to produce them. On the early Burke, you could probably blow the front third of the ship off and it would still float. Okay, it's just because you could seal off everything from the front, to the back. A prime example of that is the what was the ship?
USS Cole.
Yeah, the Cole got a hole blown inside of it that you could probably drive a bus through. Okay.
Yep, 20-foot hole. In fact, it blew up the compartment I would have been in.
And it look at the water line. It blew a hole below the water line and above the water line, and water was going in the ship.
In fact, part of this because he had a suspicion something could have happened, so he put his ship in a higher material condition, which I think was modified Zebra, which there's like multiple levels, but basically it's like a modified battle stations almost, where your ship is a lot more sealed up. Because of that, you have a big hole in it, but there's not a whole lot of water getting into the rest of the ship. It's only in the area that you have a hole in.
It's affected. Mm-hmm.
According to what you just said, if a Russian ship would have got the same thing, that ship is done.
I know on the Moskva, and I think maybe even on the Kirov, they skimped on a lot of that stuff because they wanted to get the ships out to sea. It's amazing that when you go aboard, it's like, dude, these things don't have watertight doors. You could walk from one to, it's like walking through it like in a cargo ship or something. It's just open. There's nothing there to stop anything. And that goes back again to, okay, water, but yet you also got to think of the other thing, fire. I can seal off a ship and contain a fire if I have to. If it gets in the air conditioning ducts or something like that, I think that's built in as well inside of U.S. ships to keep the fire from spreading. It's like pouring gasoline, again, to the canoe thing. You can pour gasoline petrol in one end of the canoe and light it, and it's just going to run to the front. That's essentially what one of the big problems with these with the Russian ships is fire containment.
I remember reading, I think it was the Janes, which mentioned something about a lack of firefighting equipment or like ability to deal with fire. But what you just mentioned, that answered my question in a terrifying fashion.
But about the fire, about just having just open the way it is on these ships.
Yeah, like
You can't contain it. Yeah, it's terrible. But anyway, you can go back. Cap, you got any questions for us about anything? Just, if something's kind of puzzling you, it's like,
No,
what?
not really. I mean, we've kind of got to the point where we're just repeating ourselves, really. I
Yeah.
guess at this point, I'd say, I don't know what to do with this, but has anyone got a problem with using it for rebroadcasting?
I
All this
don't
stuff
think
is
it-
public knowledge.
Yeah, it's public knowledge,
Yeah.
and obviously, some of it's speculation, and we're not considered experts, but it's interesting. Either way, guys. The main Grim Reapers videos are now being split between this YouTube channel and the Grim Reapers 2 YouTube channel. So if you want to see all of the Grim Reapers videos, please consider subscribing to both channels. And thank you for watching.